going to start
Well,
with strategic planning because we
crazy.
have Milone and Macbroom here to give a brief presentation on the updates or the revisions on the enrollment projections and the capacity information. So we have Rebecca Augur and Mike Zuba from Milone and Macbroom here to speak to everyone this evening.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint. Hopefully you can all see that now.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So we're here to give you an update on where we're at. Last time we were before you, we talked about enrollment projections. We have made some revisions to those projections that Mike is going to walk you through. And then we're going to go through our capacity analysis of your buildings and just touch briefly on alternatives and the criteria that the subcommittee has been working on. Mike, do you want to start off with the projections?
Yeah, sounds great, Rebecca. We began our work on the projections over the course of the summer and began presenting those with the committee and with the board right around the time school was starting. We did receive some input based on the historical projections, especially, or our future projections based on some historical changes of programming, especially at the individual elementary level. So that was something we dug back into all of our notes and took a look at what the influence it had on it was. And, you know, it's not uncommon to be able to get input on things that change programs and impact the cohort survival ratio. So as we really dug into the individual school persistency ratios, and if you recall back a few months ago, that's how we develop our year-to-year projections, not only for kindergarten, but really grade level to grade level. We noticed that the programmatic move there had negatively impacted the ratios there. We identified and moved correctly the number of students. However, we made some adjustments to the weighting of those persistency ratios, which changed the overall individual school projections slightly. I believe it was for Navis Inc. We had a decline of approximately 24 students out 10 years. That was roughly cut in half, and it was about a decline of about 10 students out 5 years. That was roughly cut by 4 students. And what happens when we go through and make changes to the weighting of those persistency ratios, the model then recalibrates the other schools. So we had some slight adjustments there overall, but nothing that impacted the district-wide projections. Since then, we were provided the enrollment for October, so the kids that are in school today, and we've been tracking trends throughout our clients, not only in New Jersey, but also throughout the tri-state area. And it wasn't uncommon for us to see within your current enrollment a bigger drop in kindergarten and first grade. I believe you lost about 100 students over what you would typically have historically in each of those grades. We look to be able to get some data from the New Jersey Department of Education, but weren't able to get anything posted that, or find anything posted that talked about statewide trends. So that's something we're taking a deeper look at, but it's a trend that we've been seeing throughout all of our client communities now. And it's really related to the pandemic and just some uncertainty at those lower grade levels. But I did, before I pass it over to Rebecca to talk capacity, as we get through this scenario planning and as we go through the projections, we're relying on sort of what has been the historic pattern. So looking at what we had projected for 2021 and future years, rather than relying heavily on the pandemic, which may have downwardly skewed the data and likely not to be a long-term impact, because throughout this process for our long-range planning, we're really looking at a window of 5 to 10 years, and our recommendations are going to reflect that. So Rebecca's just floating through now our elementary as well as our middle school, and then we'll get on into the capacity update portion. We know you have a jam-packed agenda for tonight.
Thanks, Mike. So Our capacity analysis of your buildings began with looking at your district's long-range facilities plan, which is filed with the Department of Education. And we reviewed that. We reviewed that in conjunction with your class size practices. We did update classroom usage and operational capacities with your building administrators, because there's been obvious changes in the districts since your last LRFP was filed. And then we went through to make sure that we were accurately capturing general education classrooms and special education self-contained rooms, because those are the types of rooms that really generate our capacity numbers. So those are the two types of rooms you're going to see in a couple of tables in a moment that are really driving the capacity numbers. These figures are based on your current program deployment. So they can be affected by changes, whether that's a movement of a program, such as movement of pre-K or special education programs. It could be a change in an educational model, how you use the actual classrooms within the building, or some kind of localized change in the physical use of the building. So these are operating capacities. They reflect the unique uses within your buildings now and the unique programs that are within the buildings now. We're using them for our alternatives planning as we move forward. So when we take a look at your elementary schools, again, we're really looking for full-size classrooms that are used for academic subject matter. And we just identified the number within each school. And then we associated a student loading level, which is based on your basic classroom size practices now. We did vary it at the elementary school level slightly for Title I schools, which in this table are highlighted in this peach color, so that the youngest grades in those more typically Title I schools are fed at 22 per classroom versus 25 in the 9 Title I schools, and that's only in the kindergarten, first and second grades. So we have an accounting of pre-K classrooms, K through second classrooms, and third through fifth grade classrooms. We have an accounting of self-contained programming rooms at the K through 5 level. And then just to understand the different uses within a building, we like to take a look at the full-size art, music, and other classrooms that are available, because it shows some great discrepancies across the district, where you have schools that do not have an art room or a music room. And then you have schools that have 1 art room and 1 music room, plus 3 additional classrooms that are used usually for intervention, OT/PT, speech, resource rooms, those kinds of uses. So these are not generating capacity for us, but they are helping us to evaluate disparities in uses across the buildings at this level. So when we calculate the capacity based on your classroom loading levels, again, sheerly based on academic rooms and these self-contained special education rooms, we come up with a maximum capacity. We calculate a 90% utilization factor on that, because you can never load a building at its full capacity. You would never have the flexibility to accommodate some fluctuations in enrollment. So a 90% utilization factor on an elementary system is pretty standard. And we know that there are also some core space issues in your elementary buildings, especially around the all-purpose rooms and the variety of uses that those rooms have to accommodate. We also know that you have some issues with a lack of kindergarten rooms at Harmony. You have to file for a waiver every year, in fact, because you just don't have the appropriate spaces per state standards for those types of rooms. So outside of these capacity numbers, we know there's some other issues to be aware of, and we do keep that in mind as we look at alternatives moving forward. But our overall operating capacity for the elementary system is right below 4,500 students. At the middle school level, we're again looking at general academic rooms for full-size classrooms, self-contained special education full-size classrooms. We take a look again at science labs and other classrooms just to understand disparities in usage or availability of those types of specialized spaces across the district in different buildings. And we were made aware in our discussions with building administrators of some issues, especially at Thompson with the cafeteria, that it's really operating at its maximum capacity. At the middle school level, we use a lower utilization factor of 85%. And that's because these buildings are more dependent on scheduling, and there's a need for a little bit more flexibility. You don't have students staying within their classroom for the bulk of the day. Their students are moving around the building. So you need a higher degree of flexibility to accommodate that. Again, 85% is a fairly standard utilization factor at this level. So comparing the general classrooms and special education self-contained rooms available across your different buildings, and just the overall difference in the number of rooms available across these buildings, Thompson's operating capacity is obviously higher than Bayshore and Thorns. And an overall district-wide capacity of about 2,900. Similarly, for the high schools, we're looking for general academic full-size classrooms, self-contained special education rooms, very similar buildings, very similar number of full-size rooms, very similar use of those other classrooms. So there's little disparity between High School North and High School South. So the operating capacity, which again is calculated based on an 85% of the max, is about 1,500 students for each building. We understand from building administrators that a lot of the core spaces within the buildings, the gyms, the cafeteria, auditorium, are taxed by that loading level. And again, we're using that 85% utilization factor for a district-wide capacity of around 3,000 students at the high school level. So then what we've done is taken those capacity figures and compared them to our projected enrollments to calculate a utilization and projected utilization. So this is the elementary system compared to your projected pre-K through 5 enrollments. And district-wide, you're operating at a pretty high level of utilization, where you're in the high 90%, projected to get just over 100% in the latter half of the projection horizon. But you have a little more discrepancy between the buildings as you look through this table, where you have some buildings that are operating in the 80% range, low 90% range, and then you have some buildings that are operating, over 110%. So there's a little imbalance in the utilization, and that is clear and obvious when you just look at our capacity analysis, in where you have some buildings that have an art room available, a music room available, and other rooms available. And then you have some buildings that don't have rooms available for those types of uses because they're using all of their full-size rooms for academic purposes, for academic regular ed classrooms. So we can see that there's a projected increase in the number of schools that are over targeted enrollments as we look through the timeline here, and that you're on the cusp of exceeding that overall target for the elementary system when you start to get into this 102% range. For the middle schools, overall, the system is operating between 75 and 80% of utilization. So that would say that there is room within the system. However, again, when we look at the discrepancy and difference between the 3 buildings, you can see that Thompson is operating at a much higher level of utilization than either Bayshore or Thorn. And it's a pretty large discrepancy. We have Thorn operating below 70% and Thompson at or above 90%. So there's space in the system, but imbalances between the schools. At the high school level, it's pretty high utilization across the district, although the projections are to slightly decrease over the next decade. South is more heavily utilized than North, and that discrepancy is projected to continue. You can see North beginning at the 95% range, dropping to about 90%. South beginning in the 108% range, dropping more to about 100%. So an imbalance between the 2 high schools, and right at the cusp of being at that target enrollment across the district. Working with the committee, the planning committee, they have developed a great rubric to use as criteria as we begin to develop our planning alternatives for the future. And we had the chance to talk to them about this recently and get some feedback and input on what exactly these goals and objectives would look like as implemented in alternative scenarios. And so we're beginning to develop those scenarios now. And it was a clear focus on looking at the middle school level and kind of writing the pathways to the middle schools to help better balance those schools is one objective that I think we're looking at that ties into a lot of these primary objectives of balancing student enrollments across all schools, so there's more equitable distribution and efficiency within the district, and paying particular attention to extracurricular and special education offerings, and having flexible space within the facilities so that there is appropriate space for all of the programming that the district desires to provide. And then further beyond that, taking into account the master facilities plan of how to help the district focus their investment on campuses that really are intended to serve the district for the long term. So we're starting to chew on these and with alternatives, and that is what we will be working with the committee on over the next month or so. So we're going to be coming up with 4 planning scenarios to present to the subcommittee. We will be developing mapping for those scenarios, and that any that involve redistricting, and we'll make sure that that mapping is available online for the community to be able to look at what the impacts would be. And then we're going to have that subcommittee help us evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of the scenarios so that we can hone in on a recommended alternative for the board to consider. Be happy to take any questions.
Has there been any suggestions on which way you should be leaning toward?
That draft rubric that was shared with us, and our discussion with the administration and committee on that was really helpful in guiding us towards a couple of scenarios, some of which are going to be looking much more long-term with other scenarios that will help us set the district up to achieve those longer-term objectives.
Yeah, and Rebecca, just to add to that, I think we want to be able to put out sort of a menu of options that some may be a little easier to implement in short term, and some may be a little bit longer looking and a little bigger lift, and then have both of those bookend that and have some in the middle as well, and then be able to get input based on that to help kind of further sort of narrow down the best direction to go in.
Are we looking at just utilizing the buildings that we have?
I think for some shorter term options that will be easier to implement, we will be looking at using the buildings you have, but with an eye towards a longer term objective to ensure that we are setting the district up to best facilitate movement towards investment in strategic locations.
Or are you talking about building buildings?
Hey, John, maybe this is where we should step in as the committee and discuss and have that discussion, because I know that we haven't invested Milone and Macbroom with those decisions. They've delivered what we've asked for, which is that capacity study as well as refining the demographic analysis. But I think Mrs. Mingui, is what you're talking about would be next steps, and the subcommittee or the committee, I guess. We're certainly not there yet. What we developed is the rubric in coordination with the administration in order to grade any potential suggestions that come out of the data. But we're effectively seeing the data along with the rest of you, as a whole for the first time. And so there hasn't been any concrete discussion of investment in new buildings versus investment in existing buildings, or even as Ms. Augur said, what a recommended alternative would be, because we're just not there yet.
When are we planning on getting there?
I think Mike just spoke to that, right? Mike, you had indicated that the next steps.
Yeah, our next steps is really putting these family of options together. And I'd like to, and I think Nick, really described it well. I think where we're starting is not at a site, at a building, at what goes in a classroom, but sort of the vision of, what could some of these pieces at 10,000 feet look like, and how did they play out and kind of work together in order to kind of set the direction at really an upper planning level. And what we're looking to do is to be able to have those options together in probably the next 4 or 5 weeks, to be able to meet with a committee, go through them, present them, get feedback, and then make revisions as necessary and come back to the board.
I mean, if you look at the data that was just provided there, the thing that jumped out at me, 2 things, was three things. So the first thing was the extreme disparity between our elementary schools. I know it was like a Spanish Inquisition, right? 1, 2, 3. So the first thing was the extreme disparity in our elementary schools. How, even though we attempt to have a consistent education across all of our buildings, it's clear through this analysis that there are some buildings that are better serving our students than others, through no fault of anybody's. It's just how the demographics lie right now. We have some students have the opportunity to have art rooms, and some students don't. I personally don't think that's fair. So I would want any proposed solution we have to go towards equity at our elementary schools. The other thing that jumped out was, as the housing comes online in the Fairview area, with that new development over there, how those numbers jump up to 145% of capacity, which means that, the time is going to come very soon to determine whether or not the community wants to build or wants to have a massive reshuffling of students in order to accommodate those students within the existing infrastructure. And then the third thing is the imbalance in our middle schools, seeing that, Thompson just carries so many more students than do Thorne or Bayshore, and what opportunities we have there, again, to balance those loads out so that our kids have a more equitable distribution, and therefore have better opportunities. So, I mean, those are my 3 takeaways. I don't know if any other members of the board or the committee want to speak to that.
I would say to longer range, the enrollment numbers about like 10 years, but it's clear our elementary schools, when you look at long range facilities plan, the state would think that you have a cafeteria, a separate APR, and even a library. None of our schools have that. Some of our, as we know, some are fairly old. We have individual air units inside the classrooms, which obviously came up as a topic during the COVID situation. So eventually, we're going to have to replace those Airedales that are inside the rooms. So we don't have APRs that don't have air conditioning. Bayshore, I mean, you can't even put a full-size basketball court in a gym. So there are different things over time. We're going to have to do investment every so often, right? I think it's been a few years since we have to figure out, well, how are we going to go about doing that next time? Is it going to referendum? Where do we put that money? In addition, even at the elementary schools, folks like the double door, where they have in schools, but I don't know if that's possible in every building. So over, in the next 10 years, we have to figure out how we address those things. I mean, at some point you have to say, what do you really want to put money in place, or in certain how that's going to come out in future.
Hey, Nick, quick question on the projection for the high schools. And that is that if you're basing the projection at the high school on the current projection at the middle school, then the idea of moving some of the middle school doesn't give you the same projection at the high school. That would be correct, right?
And I would say, Mike, that's correct under the current way that we do things, right? You know, so I would imagine that some of the suggestions that Milone and Macbroom may provide to us would maybe even change up the sending zones for the high schools. You know, the thing that, again, just going back to just looking at the raw numbers, you know, I look at those numbers like a ticking clock. And, you know, we only have as a township, I can't say as a board anymore, but we only have as a township, you know, 5 years or so to figure out how we're going to absorb these students into our infrastructure and how we're going to do it equitably. And the longer this board and this township waits to do that, the worse the decision is going to be. You know, so this is not a decision that can be put off or kicked down the road. The numbers are staring us right there in the face. 145% capacity at Fairview, a huge imbalance at Thorne and Bayshore versus Thompson. And because of where Fairview sends, you know, you don't see that imbalance then trickle into the middle schools because there's a ton of capacity at Bayshore, but that doesn't help the kids at Thompson who are in a really full school. So there are, and as John said, you know, Bayshore itself is a substandard, you know, facility from an infrastructure standpoint. The gym is not nearly as large. The layout is unique to say the least. So, you know, there are a lot of decisions to be made. You know, going back to what Joan had said earlier, I think that all of those items, Joan, that you had said, whether it's new buildings or expandings or redrawing lines, have to be on the table. But there has to be a decision made in the next year or two on short and long-term goals. There have to be, because otherwise we're going to have people moving into this community. I know we love to talk about people moving into the community. We're going to have people moving into the community, and they're just going to be staring down the barrel of substandard schools compared to Homedale, compared to Marlboro, compared to other towns. And that's not fair to the kids who are here already, nor is it fair to our taxpayers, you know, who expect our schools to help with their property values, you know, and their investments in their homes. So I just think that the time has come to start making decisions.